guests, and captivating music. Mental Health Versus, a show both entertaining and informative. Check out Mental Health Versus, Mondays at 6 p.m. on 91.3 FM WBNY.
To protect his home and family from disaster, Steve used courage, wisdom, and his camera phone.
That should do it.
Way to go, Steve! By simply taking digital pictures of his family's important documents, Steve can always have them stored safely online, no matter when disaster strikes. Learn other simple ways to protect your home and family before a natural disaster at ready.gov. That's ready.gov. A message from FEMA and the Ad Council.
All right, here we go. Welcome to Living for the People. This is L. Nathan Hare, your host here for this next hour. Welcome you to our broadcast, focused on providing insights into events shaping our national and regional world and the facts behind those events and policies that are shaping our world for today and for tomorrow. Join us weekly on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. following Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Program. And of course, our program is live, so you can call and you can join our discussion. We really hope that you will. Our number here again is 716-878-5104. That's 716-878-5104. We also have our citizen who gives us an admit card into the 21st century. He has 21st century skills, does the live streaming of the program. Welcome, Willie H. Uh-oh.
Welcome, everybody, to Living for the People with L. Nathan Hare.
I can't believe I caught him with his head away from the mic. That was Willie H. And, of course, we normally have Norma Carter here, who is usually our in-studio audience of one. But he's tied up this morning, and so it's just you and me. So I'm hoping that you will call in and join us in this discussion. I think that you'll be interested in this because this is the discussion that's going on right now. And I say discussion, that's a very euphemistic word. A very struggle is going on right now over the president's effort to try to reduce or eliminate student loan debt for something like 40 million students, I believe, have student loan debt in the country. And I need for us to understand this from a few perspectives as we discuss this. One perspective is, well, you borrowed the money, you know you were borrowing the money, you signed the paper that said that you're promising that you'll pay the money back that you borrowed. You got something in return for the money. You got a higher education or a certification, a vocational certification education, or whatever it was you used the student money for. You got that. That's in your hand. And especially if you got your associate's degree, or you got your bachelor's degree, or you got your graduate degree, or further, you have what you bought. You have it physically in your hand. So from a logic perspective, how can you buy something, borrow money from the public to pay for it, get what it was that you paid for, and then say, oh, and I'm not making the kind of money that I thought I was going to make. I'm just not going to bother to pay off this student loan. That's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. On the other hand, the student loan program is set up in such a way that it almost binds you for the rest of your life. I borrowed about $90,000 in student loan money through the State Higher Education Services Corporation, whatever the name of those loan organizations were. And every time I turned around, the interest rate kept going up or changing, or fees got changed, or if I missed a payment, and I don't even miss a payment, because I generally made every payment, but if I didn't pay it within 10 days, if I paid it in 12 days, fees would get placed on that late payment, and the fees themselves became loans. So I had to pay the fee the same way I had to pay a loan. There's like a 6% or 8% interest rate on the fees, and so on. So you had to, if you missed a payment, you had to not only catch up that payment, you had to make sure you paid that fee. or the fee becomes a continuing loan. You could end up having more money that you owe in fees than you owed for the loan that you took out in the first place. There's some of the unfairness here. And then we have the coronavirus pandemic that hit the country. And what they did in order to spare the country the wrenching that would have occurred if you had maybe 30 or 40 million people out of work who were not able to make purchases, they were no longer consumers because they didn't have income coming in. If people are not making income, they can't really be consumers. So all of the stuff that they would normally buy, socks, underwear, underarm deodorant, milk, shoes, sneakers, all the things that people consume as consumers, those things would wind up sitting up on people's shelves in stores or in warehouse shelves in manufacturing companies. Because if you can't sell the stuff that you make, the stuff that you've already made just sits still, which means it doesn't make sense for you to keep hiring people to make stuff that you can't move anyplace, so you end up laying people off. If you start laying people off, you increase the number of people who don't have money to be able to consume goods and services. And it creates this down cycle that eats away at the economy and sends you toward a recession. To combat that, this country did relief checks. People got those, I think they were $1,600 or $1,800 checks and $2,000 checks and $300 checks over here. They got enhanced unemployment where people were making more money on unemployment than they were making when they were working. Willie, you should have laughed on that one. You were one of the ones, your family benefited from that.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. Tell the truth. But all those things were done because if you didn't pump money into the hands of consumers, consumers wouldn't consume. If consumers don't consume, if they don't buy things, the consumption goods, then the people that make those consumption goods end up having to reduce their cost and lay people off, which creates more people who can't consume, which then creates a down cycling in the economy. And until something happens to break through that trend that begins to pump money back into the consumption end of the economy, you wind up with your economy being in very bad shape. So that was the decision that was made. So part of that decision making was you got people that had these student loans, and I don't know what people are paying. I was paying something like $300 or $400 a month, for mine. But I reached a point where I had enough savings that I was able to pay off a good chunk of that in one lump sum, so I wouldn't have to keep paying these interest rates. But people are paying 6%, 7%, 8% on these student loans, and they're finding themselves paying $150, $200, $300 a month just paying off their student loans. They still got rent to pay, they still got gas and electric to pay, they got the normal expenses of life, and they've got this student loan debt on top of that. So what the Biden administration tried to do was to release people from the burden of paying student loans so they could use those dollars to be able to buy consumer goods, helping to reinflate the economy. That was the Biden sort of science, on this thing. And so they used authority that they felt that they had to be able to modify student loans, where essentially they modified the loans to zero. Or they made a target amount that they would modify the loans by. So the first rung of that was $10,000, which I think is still being argued with by the Republicans, where the Biden administration was just off the top for giving $10,000 worth of the student loans that anybody had. They wanted to bump that up to $50,000. So for a lot of people, that would be the entire amount that they owed for their student loans. And even if that wasn't the entire amount, the note you had to pay on, $50 or $60 or $70,000, compared to a note you pay for, say, $10 or $15 or $20,000, is like night and day. So people really wanted to get, this break on their student loans. So that's the conundrum that we find ourselves in. The Democratic administration wanted to help those people that were being burdened by these student loans. And understand my initial caveat: they're being talked about as if they're being burdened by these student loans, but they did take out the loans. They did get the education that the loans paid for. They walked away with what it was that they bought, and they're just not paying for something that they purchased. I mean, that's basically how the Republicans are speaking about this. I'd like to hear what you all think about this. Do you feel about it the same way? Let me talk a little bit about the context in which this occurs. We have a system in this country, in our democratic system, we have a system of checks and balances, particularly as it relates to this issue of student loan cancellation. For decades, we've heard so-called conservatives and Republicans rail that the Democrats and progressives have been appointing and electing activist judges. And what they meant by activist judges was they were electing or appointing judges who were making law through their rulings on cases rather than letting Congress make laws. And their position was judges should not be making laws. Judges should just be interpreting the laws, but not making new laws. But they felt that, with Roe versus Wade and a whole range of other issues, that these activist judges that the Republicans were complaining about, they say that they were making new law through their rulings. As we've talked about in this space before, the system of checks and balances in government was developed to ensure that no one branch of government could become too powerful. The framers of the Constitution built a system that divides power between the three branches of government. You all know them: the legislative, executive, and the judicial branch of government. Enlightenment philosopher, one of the people that helped frame the ideas, the ideological framework for the democracy in the United States that we enjoy right now. His name is Baron de Montesquieu. He argued that the best way to prevent the threat of despotism, of people becoming dictators, was through a separation of powers in which different bodies of government exercise legislative, executive, and judicial power, with all of these bodies subject to the rule of law. Checks and balances operate throughout the U.S. government as each branch exercises certain powers that can be checked by the powers given to the other two branches. Executive orders are essentially official directives issued to federal agencies by the president, and these executive orders are powers afforded to the executive branch, to the president, that do not require congressional approval. They are not directly provided for in the U.S. Constitution, but rather implied by Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which states that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Executive orders can only push through policy changes. They cannot create new laws or appropriate funds from the United States Treasury. Now, why is that important? Because the source of money that the Biden administration wanted to use to be able to pay off these student loan debts was proceeds that came from the sale of Treasury bonds. So the interest rates on Treasury bonds, or the sale of Treasury bonds that you wound up essentially cashing them in for their for the principal that was borrowed, from those two revenue streams, that's where you were going to get the money, where he wanted to get the money to pay the $1.7 trillion that is owed by the student public of the United States, that is owed in student loan debt. Now, I'm not sure if he wanted to pay all of that off, but the portion he wanted to pay off through that $10,000 reduction of student loan debt, and the up to $50,000 that he hoped to achieve in reducing student loan debt per person. the source of money that he wanted to go to pay for that were proceeds that came from interest rates and sale of Treasury bonds, interest rates on Treasury bonds and sale of Treasury bonds. However, the law that creates the authority for executive orders that can be issued by the president, even though these executive orders have the power of law, they're not actually laws themselves, and they cannot be used to, if I'm remembering this correctly, they cannot be used to create new money. They cannot create new laws. They can only create policy. It could be new policy, but it can only create policy. So the executive orders that Biden wanted to push through these policy changes, although they cannot create new laws or appropriate funds, they cannot create new laws, nor can they appropriate funds from the United States Treasury. Taking funds from Treasury bonds, from the sale of the bonds, or from the interest rates on those bonds that were already sold, taking money from those sources sounds to me like you're taking money from the United States Treasury. Maybe I don't know, Willie. It sounds to me like the U.S. Treasury is the U.S. Treasury. If the U.S. Treasury is the issuer of the Treasury bonds, right, and the U.S. Treasury is the recipient of the interest rates from bonds that are sold, if you take that money and use that money to do something like forgiving people student loans, mm-hmm, you're taking that money from the U.S. Treasury. That sounds right, like I'm making sense.
Right. That sounds right.
I'm making sense?
You're making sense.
Man, that's like 2 shows in a row, making sense. So this is where the conundrum comes in. From a policy perspective, Democrats seem to have a consensus at the national level that something should be done to reduce the burden of student loan debt on students. Remember, not every student is an indigent, only makes $3 a month, type person. Almost all students, unless they're in a really, really, really wealthy family, almost all students take out student loans. So people that are in households that have $150,000 of income, $250,000 of annual income, they're taking out student loans as well. So all of these people are going to get the same benefit from the reduction of these student loans. So essentially, you're taking the private burden on individuals who chose to take out a student loan in order to pay for their post-secondary education, and you're transferring that burden from that individual a student loan borrower. You're transferring that burden to the public at large, and you're asking the entire population of the United States through their taxes to be able to pay that bill. Right. There's a lot of people that don't seem to think that's a great idea. And Willie, you and I were trying to talk about this on the way down to the radio station. I'm not sure what your thought was on it. You sounded to me like a liberal, and I'm just saying, you sound pretty favorable. Yeah, they should forgive all of those student loans.
Well, I had no complaints. The only thing I was thinking for people like you who was in a certain financial bracket that didn't need, they know you didn't need the money. Maybe what they should have did was give you guys a cut, some kind of tax, a little tax rate. Say, thank you guys. We appreciate you paying your bills.
Send me a letter with my name on it and say, Nate, I'm not giving you a dime, but I just want you to know that I appreciate you working so hard and making some tax dollars available for the rest of us, so that we can support other things that need to be done for our public as a whole. Thank you so much. We'll see you next year at tax season. Right. I mean, I would have felt better about that. Mm-hmm. It just feels, it feels, I don't know what the right word is. I was going to say icky, but that's not really a word. Right? It just feels wrong. you know, that you would just transfer the obligations of individual people who got what it was they borrowed the money for. That they got the education, or if they didn't get it, it was their fault they didn't get it. I mean, they had to go to school, they had to do the paperwork, you know, they had to take the test and do the essays and do the research and whatnot. You know, if they didn't do it, that's on them. But they received the education that they were buying with that money, and now they walk away and not pay it at all and transfer that back on to people like me who did pay. I paid off my student loans, right? I mean, I got student loans too. Now, obviously, I've been alive a lot longer than most of these students, so I had a lot more time to be able to get these things paid off. But it still feels, something just feels wrong about that. On the other hand, I understand that the only way that you can keep the economy in this country going is by making sure that consumers have money. If consumers don't have money, they can't consume. If they can't consume, then they can't buy the products that manufacturers are making. And if consumers can't buy the products that manufacturers and providers are making, then the manufacturers and providers of goods and services will stop making those products and stop providing those services, and then they'll start laying people off. And that's just going to make the problem worse, not better. So I understand it, you know, from that perspective. I just don't know that what we've come up with so far is the best solution. But I went to an article written by Zach Friedman. His article was in Forbes magazine, and he was talking about whether your student loans get canceled. Is it legal? And he said his answer is no. So this gives you an idea where people are coming from. He said there are a few things that we need to know. To answer the question of whether you will get your student loans canceled essentially depends on a single memo that the U.S. Department of Education will deliver to President Biden in the coming weeks. It talks about, this may be unfamiliar to millions of student loan borrowers who are struggling to pay off their student loans, but it's now the reality. The latest battle over student loan cancellation between progressives and the president is no longer about policy. It is now about law. This memo will include a legal analysis of the president's authority to cancel student loans unilaterally by executive order without further authorization from Congress. That's what we're talking about right now. If you're canceling student loan debt, how is that different than Trump reducing the tax rate for corporations by 41% in December of 2017? When he did that, he essentially was spending $410 or so billion. No, I'm sorry, that may be wrong. That may have been the total amount if you counted both the corporate and the income, personal income taxes. I think for corporate taxes, it was something like $270 billion in revenue that we lost because of the tax cut that he gave to corporations. Now, you may say, well, that wasn't spending. You just lowered taxes, you know, for those corporations. But the reality is, if you've built your budget on the framework of a tax rate, and then somebody lowers the tax rate without lowering expenses, by definition, you're spending money that you don't have. You know, the money that you no longer get because of the lower taxes is still in your budget. There's just no revenue stream covering that. So that was an expense without any revenue to support it. So that's where that's coming from. So here is what Friedman is saying in his article. He says, the case for student loan cancellation doesn't look good for 4 reasons. I'm going to lay out the 4 reasons, then I'm going to go through them individually. First, he says the law doesn't say that the president can unilaterally cancel $1 trillion of student loans. Now, if somebody sees a law that I missed that says that the president does have the authority to cancel $1 trillion of student loan, please send that to us. We need to look at that law so we can integrate that into our thoughts. The second reason that he says that this is likely not to occur, he says that student loan cancellation requires an explicit authorization from Congress. In other words, Congress would have to pass a law that would allow monies to be created to pay for canceling these student loans. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah.
I hope that makes sense. The third thing he says is that student loan cancellation may require a new appropriation. So when the student loan program was created, they actually created a budget for how much money they were going to allow to be spent on student loans, which is kind of a weird thing, Willie, because there is no actual cap on how much money can be borrowed. So they could have budgeted, for example, $100 billion that they felt they would give out in student loans in a given year. But what if people borrowed $150 billion? There was nothing that said that you couldn't borrow that additional $50 billion. That just added to the amount of money that that you had in your loan portfolio. So these laws are kind of iffy, the way that these laws are structured. But the student loan cancellation program may require, that's a third thing, a new appropriation. And the fourth reason that this thing may not go through as Biden wanted it to go is the Education Department has rules that limit wide-scale student loan cancellation. So for those four reasons, it seems less likely that the Biden administration is going to be successful in getting his executive order honored and being able to reduce these student loans at least at the level that he wanted to do it, on the wide scale basis that he wanted to do it. So let's talk about these things individually. The law says that the president can't unilaterally cancel $1 trillion of student loans. A proposal to cancel up to $50,000 of student loan debt, for example, could cost up to $1 trillion, according to, this is an article, let me make sure I tell you who I got this from. This is from Zach Friedman's article in Forbes magazine. He says that if Congress really intended for the president to have unilateral authority to cancel everyone's student loan debt, Congress would have explicitly stated that in a law. But conversely, this is my own wrinkle, if Congress did not want the president to ever have this authority, Congress would have explicitly stated that. But Congress didn't. The Congress didn't say anything one way or the other. They just said you had the authority to do something, but didn't say there was any limit, on that authority. So this seems ambivalent, and I think this is going to get tested out in the courts. In 1965, Congress may not have imagined that student loan debt would grow to $1.7 trillion. At the same time, Congress is not traditionally in the business of giving up its power, particularly on something as large as spending $1 trillion to other branches of government. To show how clear legal support for student loan cancellation, the Education Department would have to show that Congress in 1965 intended to relinquish all responsibility for student loans and granted unlimited authority to the Education Department to cancel student loans at will. And that does not exist in the Education Act or in the Higher Education Act, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The legal basis for wide-scale student loan cancellation, according to supporters for the Student Loan Cancellation Initiative, is Section 432A of the Higher Education Act of 1965. According to that legislation, the Education Department has authority to modify, compromise, waive, or release any right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however acquired, including any equity or any right of redemption. The language is somewhat ambiguous. A plain text reading, however, could support wide-scale student loan forgiveness. Doesn't that sound like that to you, Willie? That what the way that this law is written, if it says that you have the president has the authority, or rather the Education Department has the authority to modify, compromise, waive, or release any right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however acquired, including any equity or any right of redemption, sounds to me like the Education Department can modify student loans any way they want. But I could be wrong, right? A second reading would conclude that while the Education Department can cancel student loans, Congress granted a limited authority based on equitable considerations or other essential financial relief. It's unlikely that Congress simply granted unlimited authority for the executive branch to cancel unlimited student loan debt. From a practical perspective, it is common knowledge that the Education Department can cancel student loans on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, Biden has canceled something like $2.3 billion of student loans since he became president. The question will be whether this authority is limited or is this authority absolute? In other words, does the legislation allow the Education Department to cancel everyone's student loan debt? So that seems to be ambivalent. That's what I think is going to get tested in the courts. On the second issue that Friedman speaks to, the student loan cancellations required explicit authorization from Congress, essentially the issue is whether or not the president has the power to do that. And so Biden has called on Congress to enact student loan cancellation. Under the property clause and the appropriation clause of the U.S. Constitution, the executive branch can forgive debt that is owed to the federal government without a statutory grant from Congress. That means that Congress must grant specific authority to the executive branch before the president or Education Department acts to cancel student loans en masse. Only Congress has the authority or has the power to dispose of federal property. So this is the other side of this thing. This will make sense to you as I express this. Only Congress has the power to dispose of federal property. A student loan is federal property. A federally guaranteed student loan is federal property. Unless Congress explicitly places that authority with an administrative agency, only Congress has the power to dispose of that federal property. Supporters of student loan cancellation would need to argue that while the executive branch doesn't have the authority to enact student loan cancellation, the Higher Education Act of 1965 grants some exception because Congress granted such a right through legislation nearly 60 years ago. Or they could pass legislation that grants such unilateral authority to the president. But the likelihood that that kind of legislation would ever get passed under the current construction of our Congress and the Supreme Court, unlikely. So whatever the president is going to do, it's going to have to be done through some orchestration of executive orders. He's unlikely to get support from the Republican-controlled House of Representatives or to be able to get a bill past a filibuster in the Senate. So, Willie, I think that we're at the half-an-hour mark. So why don't we just take a quick break? We'll see you all on the other side of the break here at Living for the People at 91.3 FM WBNY.
WBNY is proud to present Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman.
Welcome to Democracy Now!
Award-winning investigative journalism.
Is the NRA imploding?
Providing relevant analysis that makes you think.
Secret State Department documents, including evidence of U.S. war crimes.
Fact-finding reports you will not hear elsewhere. Democracy Now! Airs Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. on 91.3 FM, WBNY, Buffalo.
Medicaid y CHIP ofrecen cobertura médica gratuita o a bajo costo para niños y adolescentes. Las visitas al hospital, citas médicas, medicinas recetadas, vacunas y más están cubiertas. Esto da tranquilidad a los padres si un niño se enferma o se lastima. Y los padres ahora también pueden ser elegibles para Medicaid, aun si han solicitado antes. La inscripción siempre está abierta. Visite ensurekidsnow.gov o llame al 1877-KIDS-NOW, pagado por el Departamento de Salud y Servicios Humanos de los Estados Unidos.
Tune in 91.3 FM WBNY Mondays 6 p.m. for Mental Health Versus, where Carl Shalahorn mashes up music and mental health in a way you've never heard before. Carl dives into topics such as trauma, depression, and anxiety with compelling guests and captivating music. Mental Health Versus, a show both entertaining and informative. Check out Mental Health Versus Mondays at 6 p.m. on 91.3 FM WBNY.
All right, welcome back. This is L. Nathan here. Welcome you back to Living for the People. We're here with Willie H., who does the live streaming of the program, and the voice you just heard on the previous commercial was our producer, James Braun. We hope he's doing much better. Look forward to talking to him soon. So I wanted to go through the other two reasons that Friedman felt that the Biden administration will have a difficult time getting through his initiative to eliminate such a wide-scale basis of student loans, or a range of student loans. The third element that he talked about was student loan cancellation may require a new appropriation. In other words, you would have to appropriate a pot of money the pot of money itself would limit how much student loan debt could be canceled. So that would provide a framework. So what he says is that Congress may need to make an explicit appropriation for student loan cancellation. Congress appropriated money for federal student loans, but didn't create a new appropriation for forgiveness of those same student loans. If the Education Department finds it has authority to cancel student loans, a court could require the Education Department to prove that Congress intended for all student loans to be eligible for complete student loan forgiveness. Now notice these words, that all student loans, so all, we don't know that Biden says he wanted all student loans to be canceled. That's not what he said. We don't know if there were eligibility criteria that limit who was eligible for student loan forgiveness. That's not stated. So the way that the argument is being framed, it's being framed around absolutes, but the actual argument that's being put before the Supreme Court or the federal courts is not based on absolutes. It's based on possibilities. So that may give the Biden administration some room to operate in. But I'd really like to hear from you in the audience as to what your thoughts are about this initiative to forgive so much of the student loan debt. Importantly, a court could deny student loan cancellation if the courts find that the Education Department sought to infer appropriations from ambiguous statutory text. And that statutory text would be the Higher Education Act of 1965 that I referred to before. The fourth reason that Friedman says Biden may have difficulty getting this through is that the Education Department has rules that limit wide-scale student loan cancellation. In 1966, a year after the Higher Education Act was passed, Congress created something called the Federal Claims Collection Act, which governs debt collection practices of the federal government, including for borrowers who are struggling financially. The Federal Claims Collection Act allows for compromise authority to in certain circumstances, but it doesn't grant unlimited authority to the Education Department to simply cancel student loans on a wide-scale basis. In 2016, the Obama administration and the Education Department amended and incorporated the Federal Claims Collection Act standards into the student loan program. Given this precedent, it may be difficult for the Education Department to now ignore its own internal rules that govern student loan programs. That said, the Education Department could change its rules or define the scope of these limitations. So the basic steps that Friedman says may have to or should be followed in order to get this student loan program, a debt forgiveness program, off the ground. He said there are two main paths to student loan cancellation. For the executive branch, student loan cancellation is no longer about policy. It's really about law. If Biden proceeds to cancel student loan debts unilaterally as the executive branch of government and bypass the legislative branch of government, you can expect that wide-scale student loan forgiveness will be tied up in the courts for months, if not years. If any legal challenge reached the U.S. Supreme Court, it's unlikely the court, as currently composed, would support wide-scale student loan cancellation. In Congress, student loan cancellation is very much a policy issue, not a law issue. Despite their differences, however, all three of the principals in this debate, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, that was Senator Elizabeth Warren, they agree that there should be at least some wide-scale student loan cancellation. The key differences are the amount of student loan cancellation and who has the power to forgive those student loan debts. If Biden doesn't cancel student loans, it's critical to understand this. For student loan cancellation to happen, Congress will need to pass legislation that more members of Congress can support. So I just wanted to make sure we got that thought process out here, helping us to understand what this student loan cancellation initiative is really all about and under what authority it could actually be done. The reality is you can't forgive federal debt without a law. If you owe the federal government money, you owe that money into perpetuity unless some law is created, is enacted that changes that reality. So that's why when you owe taxes to the federal government, 50 years later, you think you got everything all caught up, but you got, $20,000 you didn't pay, 50 years ago, you still owe that $20,000 and whatever fees are owed on that $20,000. That's the reality of federal debt. You can't, only Congress can forgive a federal debt. You cannot unilaterally forgive a federal debt. So that's where this is coming from. I wanted to quickly go through this issue about weaponization of the instruments of government. The instruments of government are things like the Department of Justice, the FBI, these branches or parts of branches of government that make up the institutions that are the vehicles through which the powers of that branch of government are exercised. What we have here is the Republicans that have gotten control in the House of Representatives are asserting that government previously had been weaponized by the Biden administration against conservatives, against the right wing in this country, and that weaponization is characterized by, well, you arrested 900 to 1,000 people in the January 6th, insurrection. It wasn't really an insurrection, and you used powers you didn't have, authority that you didn't have. You made up stuff, to make it seem like these were bad people when they were really good people, good citizens and whatnot. Now, that's just nonsense. You all saw the insurrection with your own eyes on television. And there's so much footage that shows you what happened. Something like 140 people, were injured, sufficiently injured that they had to go to the hospital. Mostly police had to go to the hospital as a result of the injuries that they incurred during the course of that riot, that took place in the Capitol building. So to assert that it was weaponizing the Justice Department to identify and prosecute the people that committed these crimes against the United States is just specious. But that's what Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matthew Gaetz and Paul Gosar and these other folks that represent this so-called MAGA, Make America Great Again, right-wing members of the Republican Party. That's where they're coming from. So in an article written in the Raw Story magazine, Democrats entitled "Democrat Smacks Down Jim Jordan for Ignoring Trump Corruption," Steve Cohen is a Democrat in the congressman in the state of Tennessee. He called out House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan because he had no plans to investigate abuses at the Justice Department during the Trump administration, even though he claims that this committee that he's heading is supposed to be about investigating the weaponization of the federal government. At an oversight hearing on Tuesday, Democrats argued that a rules package offered by Republicans was cut and pasted from right-wing echo chambers and that it was full of racist tropes. Cohen says, "I've been concerned about the weaponization of the federal government program, and I think it was pretty clear during the previous administration under former President Donald Trump under former President Donald Trump, it was pretty clear that Michael Cohen went to jail for doing what Donald Trump asked him to do. Donald Trump was called Individual One. He didn't go to jail. He didn't even go to jail when the administration changed and Merrick Garland became the Attorney General for the United States." Cohen, the congressman from Tennessee, recalled that Trump's former attorney was forced to return to jail when he tried to write a book about the ordeal. It came out it was the Justice Department that did that. In other words, the Justice Department used its power under the Trump administration to punish Michael Cohen for doing something that he had absolute right to do. He was convicted of a crime. He was sentenced to go to jail. He went to jail. He was in jail. And while he was in jail, he wrote a book. How can that be illegal, right? There was nothing that said he couldn't write a book. There was nothing that said that there was anything in the book that was illegal for him to share with the public. He just wrote a book that reflected his experience and what went on in his relationship with Donald Trump without getting into anything that was privileged, information. So it came out that the Justice Department did exactly that. It was weaponized against Michael Cohen. So he says, Mr. Chair, can we go back to those issues and look at the weaponization that occurred during the Trump administration, particularly that Michael Cohen incident? So Jim Jordan responds. He says, well, I only remember the falsehoods Michael Cohen allegedly said during his testimony before Congress. Cohen says, well, do you remember when Michael Cohen went to jail? And Jim Jordan says, well, I remember that too. He says, and then he says, and they put him back in jail when he was going to publish a book because they wanted him to not comment on it. And do you remember that when they put him back in jail, they put him in solitary confinement? This is Cohen speaking again. And he says, should we not be able to study that because you don't know it? The Tennessee Democrat wondered. He says, that's weaponization. Just because you claim, Jim Jordan, that you don't remember it or you don't know it, that's not a reason why your investigation committee investigating the weaponization of government should not investigate this. This is something that needs to be investigated. But Jim Jordan just tried to change the subject. And Cohen says, well, what you said is not an answer. Jordan tried to change the subject to something about accusing Democrats of targeting parents. And what he was talking about was courses being taught that covered material that some parents felt made them feel ashamed or made them feel embarrassed or made them feel that they were less noble because the material that was covered showed that as a group, white people as a whole accepted, not necessarily that all of them practiced enslavement or apartheid in this country, but they accepted that being done to black and brown people. And that was a dishonorable thing, a reality that took place in the history of the United States. So you've got Republicans saying, well, we shouldn't be teaching that because it makes the kids of white people feel bad. It makes the white parents feel bad. So Cohen is saying, I hear what you're saying, but that's just not the point. That's got nothing to do with the weaponization of government. So Jordan says, well, you may not like my answer, but that's my answer. He says, and I'm allowed to give the answer I want to give. And so Cohen says, well, I'm all for parents, but that's not the issue. The issue is the weaponization of the Justice Department that happened under Trump like never before in our country. House Republicans have vowed to investigate the so-called weaponization of the federal government by Democrats, corporations, and the so-called deep state. So we'll hear more about this. I just wanted to get you some context about what is meant by this weaponization of government. Real quickly, I think we have enough time to talk about this. Marjorie Taylor Greene's her legacy. This is the woman who blurted out that we need to separate, and have a divorce between the red states and the blue states, and they should have different governments because we can't fix it. It's just too broken. It can't be fixed. So the best thing to do is just to break them up, and each state ought to have its own government. And so instead of having 50 states of the Union of the United States, we'd have 50 separate countries. That's what Marjorie Taylor Greene is essentially saying. This was discussed in an article written by James Bickerton, States Bidding to Secede Respond to Marjorie Taylor Greene's Divorce Idea. Now, the thing that's so stupid about this article is these are the states that want to secede who say that they're not with Marjorie Taylor Greene because she's not going far enough. She's not saying the right things. They want separate countries. They don't want just to divide the red and the blue states. They want separate countries, every state to be its own country. Here's how it goes. Groups seeking to turn Texas and Vermont into independent countries have spoken out following Marjorie Taylor Greene's controversial call for a national divorce between red and blue states in the United States. The House Republican argued irreconcilable differences between left and right mean the U.S. is not working in its current form, so the federal government should be stripped of most of its power. That's Marjorie Taylor Greene. Forgive me for my accent if it's not correct. Instead, authority over most policy areas, according to Marjorie Taylor Greene, would be almost completely given to the individual states, with a small central government remaining to take care of border security. Now, I want you all to think about that. If they did this, then you'd have a central government whose basic job would be border security. But where would the resources come from to defend the border? Where would the resources come from to keep people out of the United States or to capture people in different states, which would now be individual countries, with a central government running around to each of these countries, separate countries, trying to identify people that were illegal immigrants, capture these people, and then send them back across the border to Mexico? Where would all of that, come from? Who would do all of that? How would that be orchestrated? So, responding to Greene's comments, Daniel Miller, who's the president of the Texas National Movement. You all know we still have this Lone Star State. People claim that Texas ought to be its own state because they're the energy producers of the world. Of course, they never say that it's the federal government, your tax dollars, that made the Texas economy happen in the first place. Who do you think built those pipelines? Who do you think built the gas lines? Who do you think built these electric lines? Who do you think made water available? Who do you think built these roads? Who do you think built the infrastructure that Texas has that made it possible for the oil business to grow in Texas? That was done with your tax dollars. Now, they want to walk away like the student loan people. They want to walk away with your tax dollars and keep it for themselves and then tell you they're going to sell back to you your stuff, the oil that you created through your investment in Texas, turning it into a place that had a large oil industry that could support the economy in Texas. They want to then turn around and let them sell you back the oil that you created. It's just beyond belief. The United States isn't a country, Daniel Miller says, talking to Newsweek, which is a conservative magazine. He says that the United States is a political and economic institution, and it is terminally broken. So the Texas National Movement believes that the federal government has overstepped its role consistently and is prohibiting Texas from freedom and economic prosperity. Well, we should just put a dollar value on all of the infrastructure that was created for Texas. We should put a dollar value on that and make Texas have to pay it back. So that may be something like $2 or $3 trillion. Make Texas have to pay that money back, to the United States, right? I guarantee you they wouldn't be saying that at this point. Was that a caller coming in? Let me get that call real quick. Hi, caller, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, Mr. Hare.
Hi, how you doing?
Just fine, just fine. Your point is very well taken. But here's the interesting rub: is we have a Supreme Court now that's consistently ruling in a I don't even know how to characterize it. So for instance, when it comes to birth control and to abortions, we now have a problem where individuals in states who may or may not be entitled under their own states to have access to these items want to withhold the interstate delivery through the mail of prescriptions and the like that they used to be able to get under a federal mandate. Because interstate commerce, at least up until this morning, was the province of the federal government, right? Right. I don't know how that's going to play out. I think that's yet to be contested in court. But here's what's interesting. I don't think anyone would contest interstate commerce until all of a sudden we put into state hands and they want to weaponize it at the state level. Yep. And so this is where things are getting really messed up, because if we devolve, as we seem to be doing, into states having to have their own legislation to duplicate or replace what the feds used to have, then we're going to have all this differentiation amongst states, and it will ultimately hit the road when it comes to interstate commerce of goods and items that would have been available to states before, but that are now deemed no longer available by those individual states. And just think about the chaos that would create. It already is created. Right. It's happening right now as we speak. So to her credit, not to give much credit to Marjorie Taylor Greene, she is reflecting the current reality that we're evolving to right now. New York State has had to beef up and still has things to beef up in its women's productive rights laws. Other states are doing the same. And we're fortunate that we have a legislature right now in New York State. It's completely democratically controlled in both houses. They're able to pass these laws. We wouldn't have been able to do that just 5 years ago. And of course, 5 years from now, it may not be the same, and it could end up with a conservative Republican right-wing legislature that could do the same things they were doing in Pennsylvania. Which is why in New York State, they're now, I think, moving to make this a constitutional amendment rather than just simply a legislative decision. Right. Make it as hard as possible for them to change this thing. Right. So everybody is like, it's like hardening the bunker. They're trying to make it bulletproof, and if our reliance or ability to depend on the federal to have some commonality in our commerce, in our what is privacy, what is protected, what's not, falls apart, then I think we are heading towards the world that Marjorie Taylor Greene is talking about. Will all be individual colonies? Yeah. So just think about Europe. You got 33 or so, whatever it is, countries that make up the European Union. Think about what it would be if they didn't like each other. If they were at each other's throats. Well, actually, they're having that problem right now. Right. I mean, I'm sorry to say. I mean, look at the difference with Poland right now. I mean, even though they're helping Ukraine and really out there, but they're way off in a different world. In fact, they're having disagreements. They're getting pushed by the European Union to adhere to, I don't know what the specificalities are, but they're pushing back. We don't want to go by that rule and still be in the EU. Because like Hungary, with Viktor Orban, right? They don't believe in the democracy that the rest of the European Union bought into. Well, that's it. There's flavors of democracy we're talking about now, right? How democratic do you want to be? And I'm not going to say that everything the EU does is perfect by any means. But everyone wants to challenge their rules, I guess. And there's very conservative elements in each, whether it's in New York State even. I'm even in our own backyard here. So I mean, I could see good reasons to call for secession from Buffalo City from Erie County.
And I could see the New York State saying, well, you know, we got a lot more relationship with Quebec and Ontario than we have with Washington. Why don't we just secede and go hang out with Quebec and Ontario?
Okay, I mean, we might want to join that coalition. I don't know. I mean, Buffalo at least.
Right. I mean, it seems silly, but it's not silly if we're going to press these other, arguments. It makes other things, hit the table.
I think if you look at the numbers, if you look at the wealth gap, I think it would turn out, you would find out that if people really recognized where their bread is buttered or where their success lies, is you still have a very limited number of people and corporations that are controlling a vast majority of everything that's going on and keeping us fighting amongst ourselves.
Yep.
And so as long as we keep going down that track, we will keep fighting amongst ourselves and go down this bad path. And if people would recognize our commonalities that, due to relatively almost indifferential, compared to the billions that the highest and wealthiest and the people who are controlling things have, compared to the rest, the numbers are relatively small. The gap between moderately, rather poor and middle class is a fraction compared to being super wealthy.
And the middle class is shrinking from being 62% of the population.
Upper middle class won't agree. They'll tend to side more towards the wealthy, and that's where the division.
But listen, that music in the background means they got the hook on us.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. And just so you all know, what he's really speaking to here is we have a pendant going on in this country right now of pitting each other against each other. That is a loser's game. Pitting each other against each other cannot be the way to go. That just cannot be. So let's think this out using common sense. Look forward to talking to you all on Friday here at Living for the People at 91.3 FM WBNY. We'll see you all then.
To love.